Upper molar DO. So we've got a distal contact over here, but still not a distal contact on 14. So obviously I'm going to do the DO over here on 3. And then if you had had that same situation, you would have wanted to do the MO on 14. But of course I have a partial prep on that one already. But that's the thought process that I wanted you to go through. So let's go back to the 330 burr. And we're going to do exactly what I was showing on the lecture slide. I'm going to put a hole right next to the adjacent tooth. And as close as possible to the adjacent tooth, but in the middle of the contact, facial-lingually. And of course, I would hope you'd use a newer burr than this. So every prep should be a new burr. So I'm going to go out facially. Still a little bit farther. Again, trial and error. Okay, now I know I'm going to get facial clearance, so I can cut straight in from there. And that's pretty close to 90. Presuming we're doing an amalgam prep. So that wall's pretty much perpendicular to the surface at the margin. Now let's go lingually. Again, with the burr as close as we can get it to the adjacent tooth. A little farther. And a little farther. And that's about right. So now we're going to cut from there in straight. And we'll adjust the angle until it's 90 degrees by trial and error. It's a little bit obtuse now. Then we always start the margin and cut inward until we get the angle just the way we want. If the wall is taller than the burr, I might have to cut in at 2 different levels in order to get that wall nice and flat. So the lingual side's starting to look pretty good. Alright, so now we need to include the distal pit. Now in this typodont, there's 2 distal pits. Weird, huh? Okay, so we have to include both of them, so I'm going to have to include this pit over here. So I'm going to look along the oblique ridge, start right here, and then cut toward my eye, and just try to include that pit, just barely. Okay, that's about the best I can do on this typodont because of the anomalous 2-pit thing. You'll see the lower arch also has, the lower first molars also have 2 distal pits. Now I'm going to just smooth the connection in there, and then I'm going to get rid of the excess over here. Make a flat floor. Now we have the occlusal outline the way that we want. Now let's see, the wall height here is still a little bit short. So I'm going to go a little deeper pulpally, coming through this area. So the wall height in here is 1.5 millimeters tall, and I'm going to go into the distal angle groove until I get 1.5 millimeters there. And then we're okay. So now we're ready to go gingivally. Okay, so now I'm going to put the burr where I want it axially. I'm going to put it against the facial wall. I'm going to keep the burr vertical, and I'm going to drill a hole and then cut away from that wall. Let me do the same thing on the lingual side. Put the burr against the lingual wall, make sure it's vertical, position it where I want to axially, drill a hole, and cut away from this wall. Okay, then when we make the connection together, we should have a nice shape for the axial wall. Let's go ahead and get rid of the excess. Steps 5, 6, and 7, get rid of excess along the facial, along the lingual, then in between. Smooth the gingival floor all the way to the margin. This burr will allow you to do that. Then you can see how much clearance you have gingivally. Still got a little hook on the lingual margin. You can trim part of that away with the burr, and then the rest of it we're going to use a hand instrument for. Let's smooth the gingival floor a little more in this area here. Okay, so let's go ahead and use the hand instruments. In the upper left, the upper right, I'll use the hoe for the facial lingual walls. So I'm going to come down the facial wall like this, using the mirror so I can look down that margin. I'm going to sharpen the internal line angle. Come down the lingual margin, looking down the wall in the mirror. Sharpen the internal line angle. Then I'm going to use the enamel hatchet. Put the sharp edge against the axial wall, and then I can make the retentive groove into the facial wall, and then into the lingual wall. Then I can use the distal gingival margin trimmer when I turn the patient to the right to bevel the axial pulpal line angle and angle the gingival floor all the way to the facial lingual wall. So all this should sound pretty familiar. So again, if you're not using the hand instruments doing each of these things, you're not finishing the prep, so you won't learn how to finish the prep. Okay, but that's all we have to do for this prep. So the lower arch, so I'm going to position myself. I'm going to bring the patient as far as I can away from the table here. And then I'm going to position myself between the patient and the table so I can look along the arch. Okay, so back to the 330 burr. So I'm looking along the arch so I can see exactly where the central groove is. I can see there's a distal pit over here, and there's also a distal pit here. Again, on these typodonts, both Kilgore and accidental, there's 2 distal pits, which is a little bit weird. So we're going to make sure we include both of them. So I'm looking along the arch. I'm leaning the burr lingually. I know I'm leaning the burr lingually because I can see I'm leaning it lingually. I have the burr perpendicular to the line between the cusps. And I can see I'm extending right into the distal groove. Right there. So I included that distal pit. Now, I might turn to the side a little bit just to mark where the distal buccal groove is and the lingual groove and the buccal groove. And then come back and look this direction when I'm smoothing everything out. So I'm preserving the triangular ridges between the grooves, and I'm making sure that all the walls are just a little shorter than the burr. And that's basically all I have to do. Okay, so as far as the occlusal outline, that's pretty close. It's a little bit narrow for amalgam, but if it were composite, it would be fine. But again, we're always aware of how tall the walls are, and we're always trying to preserve triangular ridges wherever we can. Now I'm going to switch positions because I need to get close to the adjacent tooth and I don't want to hit it, so I'm going to look this direction. And I'm going to nip over right next to the adjacent tooth, right in the middle of the contact. That's what we always do. We always cut right to the middle of the contact. So there I am. Now I don't have much of a contact here, but we can still make it work for this illustration. So I'm going to go out facially. Again, I know how close I am to the adjacent tooth. I can go lingually. I know how close I am to the adjacent tooth there. And again, just a reminder, always use a new burr for every prep. So now I'm going to lean over this way and check the clearances. I've got enough on the lingual. I need to do a little bit more on the buccal. Trial and error until we get the clearances that we need at the same level of the pulpal floor. Okay, and then we're going to cut inward from both of those margins and adjust the angle until it's 90 degrees. How do I know it's 90 degrees? I look down the wall in the mirror and see if it's 90 degrees. It's still a little bit obtuse. So I find the margin, I get the angle, I get the length, and then I make the smooth curve to join the isthmus. Same thing on the facial. Find the margin, find the angle, get the length. Let's see if it's the right angle. Almost. Go a little bit closer to 90. So I'll get the margin, get the angle, get the length, make the curve. So now we're ready to go gingival. How about that? So I'll switch over to the 55 burr. So now, instead of doing trial and error, I can just look this direction. So I know where I'm putting the axial wall. I know how close I am to the adjacent tooth. Check to make sure the burr is vertical the way we have on all the preps so far. Drill a hole at that wall and cut away from that wall. So that's the beginning of when we go deeper gingivally. Put the burr against the fascia wall. Make sure it's vertical like the fascia wall is. Drill a hole at the wall and cut away from that wall. Now, a lot of people have pointed out that you can't see the fascia wall. And they've asked, well, how can I see the fascia wall? Well, the good news is you can't. I guess the good news is nobody can, so don't feel bad about not being able to see it. The really good news is you don't need to. All you need to do is finish the occlusal outline well, and then when you do go gingivally, you don't need to see the wall. You need to see how far you are axially and how close you are to the adjacent tooth. Then we can cut away the excess and do steps 5, 6, and 7 on both the facial lingual sides, and then in between, smooth the gingival floor right to that margin. Okay, so now we're looking pretty good. Now I'll take that step away a little bit from the pulpal floor, but that's about what we're looking for. Now we're ready to finish it up with the hand instruments. But again, the thing is the direction that you're looking. Notice for me to look parallel to the contact downward at a 45-degree angle, then come around this way and look down the axis to see the angles and so forth, I don't have to move very much. That's because I focused pretty close. Okay, so now when I'm using the hand instruments, as always when we use the hand instruments, we have to look down the wall. So make sure you're looking down the wall. Make sure you line up the instrument so it's perpendicular to the surface when you come down that margin. Trim off any hook of unsupported enamel you might see. Do the same thing on the lingual side. Trim off that little hook that's down there. Sharpen the internal line angle. Same thing on the facial side. And now we're ready to use the hoe against the axial wall. Again, you don't care what instrument you're using as long as it's the right one. So we're going to make sure that we choose the instrument by shape and not by name. So I'm going to look down the wall here. I'm going to lean the instrument away from the wall and use the upper corner of the instrument to cut into the lingual wall just the way we have before. Same thing on the facial side. So that's how we get those retentive grooves going. So of course I want you to be practicing that. Then we're going to use the mesial gingival margin trimmer since it's an MO, and angle the gingival floor all the way to the facial lingual walls. The gingival margin gets really, really clean in a patient. You're getting rid of the undermined enamel. That margin gets really, really clean. And then we're going to bevel the axial pulpal line angle. In this case, it's pretty short axial wall. So just make a subtle little bevel. Okay, and that's all we need to do.